Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second annual Edward Kremers Seminar on the History of Pharmacy and Drugs. My name is Lucas Rickert. Just briefly, I'm an associate prof in the UW Madison School of Pharmacy, and I'm the historical director of the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. It's my privilege and it's my honor to introduce this year's seminar. Last year, the Edward Kremers Seminar, which we're calling lovingly our Kreminar, was launched as a way to achieve a few goals. So for those interested in intoxicants, in medicines, in pharmacy, pharmaceuticals, and the like, I thought it was really important to help build some community for younger scholars and more established scholars, as well as share some insights across time periods and disciplines, maybe even advance some scholarship and generate new ideas. And so we're hoping that this is the forum to do just that. Now, at the same time, we wanted to promote broader understandings of substances and broader understandings of pharmacy and pharmaceuticals more generally. So why Edward Kremers? Kremers was the second dean of the School of Pharmacy here in Madison. He also co-founded the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy in 1941. Kremers pushed humanistic approaches within health sciences and professional education. He believed also, and importantly, that we needed to be open-minded when developing interpretations and policies related to substances in American society. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from traditional and ancestral Ho-Chunk land here in Madison, Wisconsin. I'd like to thank my excellent colleagues in the History of Science, Medicine, Technology here on the UW-Madison campus, both grad students and faculty. I'd like to acknowledge the many people in the AIHP and the School of Pharmacy that made this happen behind the scenes. It includes Kristen Husett, and it includes Anna Reinhardt and Greg Bond and Naomi Rendina, and I'm probably forgetting others, but it's important to name these people. This year's Kreminar is larger than last year. This year, the Kreminar is co-sponsored by the University of Kentucky College of Arts and Sciences, as well as the Alcohol Drug History Society. Dr. Claire Clark at Kentucky is the co-organizer of this seminar. I believe she's at the AIHM meeting today, and unless she's here now and I just don't see her. But she will be the host for other future sessions, and it's just fantastic working with her. She's top-notch, first-rate. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Jonathan Jones, who's currently a postdoc at Penn State, and will then be moving into an assistant professorship at VMI. He is, I'm so glad, agreed to be our moderator for these sessions. So we're very lucky to have him involved in moderating the Q&As. Our theme this year is opiates and opioids. This is hugely important in contemporary context, as well as historical context. I'm so glad you're able to join us for this first session. I'm not going to try and frame that importance for you. I'm not going to give you stats and statistics about opioids and opiates in society now. Instead, I'm going to let our amazing speakers frame their work without me. So our first speaker today is Professor Benjamin Breen from UC Santa Cruz. His interests are wide, and these include the history of globalization, science, drugs, and the long-term impacts of technological change. He was trained as an early modernist, and his book, The Age of Intoxication, The Origins of the Global Drug Trade, was published in 2019 by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And I was delighted to hear that it's being released in paperback this summer, maybe next month even. And I'd also just like to suggest to you that he has a brand new article in the Historical Journal that is now, I believe, open access and freely available, which interrogates psychedelic substances, which you should read immediately after we finish this session. But I'll not go through the laundry list of publications and other excellent public-facing work that Ben has done. Instead, I'm going to turn it over to him. And Dr. Breen, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luke. I really appreciate that really generous introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming. And also just to the organizers, a huge thank you. It seems like a really amazing lineup of speakers you have for the series, and I'm really honored to be the first one. And I'm excited to see the future speakers that are coming up. And then just finally, AIHP actually, I think, gave me my very first grant when I was a first year graduate student. If not that, then maybe the second grant I ever got in my academic career. So I really just want to give a huge shout out to AIHP for supporting me at that point when I was, just starting out. So it means a lot to be speaking here now, here in scare quotes. Yeah, so I'm going to just begin. What I'm going to basically do is go quite quickly through some major points from the sixth and final chapter of my book. And I'm going to move fairly fast through it because I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A. But just before I even begin, if you want me to send you my slides, just email me. I'll give you my email address at the end and get in touch. Or I'm happy to share primary sources that I'm quoting from or just talk about individual parts of it, because I will be going fairly fast just to save some time. So yeah, what I wanted to talk about is actually sort of a revision of my thinking for the final chapter of the book that was mentioned, The Age of Intoxication. I've been researching the history of opiates in a more contemporary context more recently, like this year, and it's changed my thinking to a certain extent, which maybe we can talk about in the Q&A, especially about this. What I'm thinking of is the second way of looking at opium, the early modern phase of the drug. But before we get to that, I'll just kind of start us off. And I always like to when I teach the history of drugs, I enjoy using this image, even though it's not specifically about the history of drugs itself. The Conjurer, it's a sort of lesser painting by Hieronymus Bosch. And I really love this painting as a sort of glimpse at an audience of early modern consumers, really, people who are maybe in a marketplace and they're being tricked by this conjurer who's basically playing 3-card Monte, like a early modern version of a familiar game, the little game with cups. And he's got this little golden ball that he's showing them. And yeah, I also thought it was fitting because I'm going through 3 different ways of looking at opium. And I think each of them has a little bit of an illusory nature. There's a little bit of a sleight of hand going on in the ways that each of these 3 different phases of the history of opium have been understood. Also, just in passing, I love the little owl and the little dog. And when I look at this painting, I often think that the owl is the only character in the painting that actually knows what's going on. Everyone else is sort of being tricked in some way. And the owl has this sort of skeptical look, which I think influenced the choice of book cover, because I found a very similar skeptical looking owl in a painting of Smoking Monkey that I used for the cover. So what I want to start with is another image that I really have always been drawn to ever since I started researching the history of drugs. Many of you may have seen it before, but what I love about it is the sense of scale, and it's extremely evocative and almost kind of moving for me to think about. So I'm starting with a strong zoom in a tiny corner of an engraving from 1850 or the 1850s. And as you can start to see, it's a warehouse. And this is a warehouse actually of opium in Patna in British India. And I sort of suspect the engraver has exaggerated the scale of this building. It doesn't quite seem right to me. And yet at the same time, at least in a metaphorical sense, that scale is accurate. By the mid-19th century, the opium trade was reaching colossal proportions. It was becoming a major factor, not just in the drug trade or the history of pharmacy, but really in world history. And what we can see in this image is a sort of I think, really iconic depiction of the industrialization of opium, and in large part of pharmaceuticals and drugs in general in the 19th century. The rise of this sort of modern concept of drugs, which has been written about so evocatively and so well by David Courtwright and others, this sort of modern drug trade emerging. But something I also, as I look at this image more, when I first saw it, I kind of thought of it in terms of like the Raiders of the Lost Ark scene in Indiana Jones. It's like this, you're impressed by the scale of this building. And I thought about it largely in economic terms. But then as I look at it more, I see in each of these little balls of opium, actually quite large balls of opium, individual lives, like the lives of the people who harvested it, the lives of the people who consumed it. And when we think of each of these balls in terms of perhaps its potential to cause overdose death, you could possibly imagine them leading to being potent enough to cause dozens of overdoses per opium ball. You could also imagine them in terms of the life hours spent harvesting and preparing them. And of course, you can also think about it in terms of the people actually working in the drug trade. In some cases, enslaved people, even into the 19th century. In other cases, people living in a sort of indentured servitude with enormous colonial violence attached to that. So I always think it's important to kind of start off thinking about it from a people-centric point of view. In some ways, I regret the title Origins of the Drug Trade, because I'm emphasizing this sort of movement of objects and substances as opposed to people. But really what my interest in the entire topic has to do with these actual human beings, not just the economic history or the history of these substances on a purely pharmaceutical level. So what I'll be talking about for the rest of this talk is really emphasizing how people interact with opiates. Really I'm going to go back to the classical era and the ancient world, but mostly I'm an early modernist, so mostly 1500 to the 19th century is what I'll be focusing on. And once we get up until the 19th century, we do start to see something that looks a little bit like a modern regime of states policing the use of opiates. So, for instance, you have the Emperor of China saying opium is a poison, which is a very, I think, we could think of it as a more modern concept of thinking about drugs in terms of public health. Its use is prohibited by law. So that's also a fairly recent concept, the idea of states being able to prohibit drugs, not necessarily that old. And also this concept of deceitful merchants, this idea of drugs as having a role in global capitalism and the sort of power politics of global trade. So how do we get there, though? Because that's in many ways the starting point of how we in contemporary life think about the history of opiates. But from my perspective as an early modernist, this is in some ways an end point. It's not the beginning, it's actually the ending of another story. And that story is a world where opium and opiates, and I'll get into the distinction shortly, is not illegal, and in some cases is not even illicit at all, and in fact is actually kind of a part of common everyday life in places, for instance, like apparently 18th century Paris, because we have this little opiate merchant with his little wagon full of opiates walking through 18th century Paris and actually being recorded in this engraving called Clé de Paris, which is just like literally just showing all the different street hawkers in Paris. So there's a guy selling hot potatoes, and then there's a guy selling good opiates for teeth. And it's just kind of part of the scope of everyday life. He's not doing it in a secretive or furtive fashion. He's got this happy little child servant or indentured servant who's selling opiates for him as well. And everyone looks pretty happy about it, including even the horses that seem to be smiling in this image. So in some ways, I see this as really like one of the main puzzles that I confronted as I thought about the history of opiates, because I expected to see, frankly, I expected to see a lot more stigma surrounding these drugs in the 18th century. And as I'll get into, you do start to see that emergence. But what I really see is happening here is a divergence between the European conception of opiates as something which is homegrown to European medicine. And it quite literally is homegrown. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy, is native to Europe. And it's also something which is embedded into the European medical tradition from the Middle Ages all the way through the 18th century. And then we start to see this exotification of opium, or an orientalization of opium, the association of opium with the Ottoman Empire, with Persia, with China. And this increasingly kind of overwhelms this older role for opiates as legal medicines. and becomes the dominant one. So that's the big shift that I'm sketching out. And before I get into talking about that moment of transition in the early modern period, I do want to very briefly go through, I think, some misconceptions, at least misconceptions that I had when I approached this topic about what opium actually is and where it's from. And as I'll mention, I think those are still circulating to various degrees today. Then I'll discuss the main focus of what I've been researching on this topic, the sort of orientalization or exotification of opium, exoticization, I'm sorry. And then finally, the conversion of opium into modern pharmaceuticals, the sort of present day concept of opioids or opiates, derivatives like morphine, hydrocodone, and other opiate medications that are used and sold in pharmacies. So these are my three ways of seeing opium. And just to start with, what is opium? It's not necessarily obvious. It's not something which, especially in terms of where opium poppies are from, I don't think it's widely known. As best I can tell from reading the contemporary archaeological literature, this is still a picture that's emerging, but it does seem that the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, is first domesticated in Western and Central Europe. So it's literally a homegrown plant of present-day France, Spain, Switzerland, perhaps the Mediterranean, but really alpine areas of Europe seem to be where it's actually first domesticated. And when we talk about opium, we're talking about the latex of the opium poppy. So the sort of sap, collected latex of the flower pods. And this is not the same type of poppy, but maybe one way of understanding the origins of opium domestication, of opium poppy domestication, is that it's sort of a marginal plant, much like the corn poppy, that grows along the edges of farmland. So in Neolithic Europe, when farming is expanding, like barley farming in particular, it's sort of moving out into these regions where agriculture was not present. And maybe we can imagine the opium poppy being a sort of companion of human agricultural expansion, moving along these marginal farmlands, being reseeded as people begin to grow more crops. And then eventually people find both a culinary use for poppy seeds and a medical use, and even potentially a religious or spiritual use for the latex of opium. This is just in broad outlines the story that we can kind of reconstruct from archaeological findings. Really, it doesn't actually start to enter the historical record, aside from some mentions in the Odyssey and in Homer, until we get to classical Greece. Then we start to see mentions of opium used in medicine and religious iconography. Now, I mentioned a misconception that I had when I began this project. I have read repeatedly that opium is native to ancient Sumer. And so you can see here, these are actually official Drug Enforcement Administration images from their webpage, where they straight up say opium is in use since 3400 BC. It was known as Hu-Gil, the joy plant, and then it moved from the Sumerians to the Assyrians to the Egyptians, et cetera, et cetera. What I see this as effectively is a sort of modern day version of that orientalization of opium that I mentioned, because it's basically entirely false as far as I can tell. Despite the fact that you still see it repeated in a huge range of books. I'm not singling anyone out here. I thought it too, until I really dug into what Hu-Gil is and who came up with this translation and this correspondence between something supposedly called the joy plant and opium. And as you can see, it shows up everywhere. If you search Hu-Gil or joy plant on Google Books, you'll find literally hundreds, if not thousands of references in books, ranging from medical texts to culinary books and gardening books, et cetera. Now, the fact is, we can say straight off that the 4th millennium BC thing is false, because actually, despite the fact that it's always repeated, even if we look at the original claim, it turns out to be about the 7th century BC. So very different timeline. It's not about ancient Sumer, it's about the Assyrians. And furthermore, as cool as this book seems to be, The Devils and Evil Spirits of Babylonia, seems like a great read. It's not an authoritative text. It's written in the 1920s. The person writing it is by no means an expert in translating ancient Near Eastern texts. And even he says it's very tentative. So when we actually try to dig into it in the literature, and when people who are actually able to read cuneiform texts actually address this topic, the best guess is that it's actually a reference to cucumbers, a form of cucumber. It has nothing to do with opium. So from the very beginning, when we start thinking about opium as a Near Eastern plant or a Western Asian plant, we're getting off on the wrong track. It is from Europe, as far as I can tell. And I've written about this in a blog post. If you're interested, I'll shut up about this. This is kind of my hobby horse about the history of opium. But I do think it's really significant for thinking about the early modern phase of opium, because what we see is there's the conversion of something which has a very long tradition of use as a fairly widely accepted medicine in medieval and, let's say 15th century Europe, slowly evolving into something which gets associated with Indies drugs, which is the main mental category that I work with in my book. This idea of drugs from the Indies, which become associated with global trade, colonialism, and European medicine's interaction with other epistemologies of health from other parts of the world. So one of the dominant themes of this kind of second way of seeing opium is the rise of opium smoking, which I personally would love to learn more about. It seems to me like an open topic for further research, especially from people who have language abilities relevant to Southeast Asia, which I think is where a lot of the story emerges and where a lot more future work could be done. And then there's also this increasing iconographic and literary association of opium with the Turks. So you can see this book, Opiologia, like it's been translated multiple times and quite influential. The frontispiece is a man in a turban wearing Ottoman clothing harvesting opium. So this is the beginning of this shift. And one really early kind of sign of what happens with opium actually goes back to 1590. So this is a really beautiful manuscript that was owned by Charles Boxer, the historian of early modern Japan and the Portuguese Empire, called the Boxer Codex. And in the Boxer Codex, this is translating it from Portuguese, there's a claim that the Javanese eat an herb called antion, and this causes them literally to run amok. So that thing at the end there, shrieking amok, amok, is the origin of the term running amok. And opium is in fact antion. If you actually look at the etymology of what the author's talking about, it's a series of slight mistranslations or phonology changes in the word, but it ends up just being Portuguese amphiao, which is just associated with the opium poppy. So maybe there's just some kind of miscommunication here, but it seems likely to me that the author is expecting there to be this sort of long-standing traditional drug use in Java, which is taking on a different role. If the author knew that this stuff was actually, in fact, the same thing that's in mithridate or theriac, or old number of common compound medicines, which most elite early modern Europeans would have consumed in their lifetime, they might have been confused, because increasingly this sort of Indies version of opium gets separated from the types of opium and laudanum sold by apothecaries. And what we see happening as well is even someone who's a little bit more knowledgeable about the words used, like Francis Bacon was actually quite interested in opiates, it turns out. And again, when I say opiates, I'm actually using the early modern meaning of the word. So this is translated from Latin. Usually when I come across references to opium in early modern languages and texts, they usually say something like opium, but if they're writing in Latin, it's often common to say opiates. And I'm still kind of figuring out the shifting meanings of the word opiate. But you can see that this is a translation from Latin from 1677 that uses the word opiates in a manner somewhat like the way we might today. And Bacon is basically saying opiates have a good effect from a bad cause. So he's not entirely anti-opiate. In fact, they have a good effect. So that's kind of pro-opiate. But if you keep reading in his discussion of opiates, he does show this shift of associating opiates with the Arabians. So he says the Grecians, the ancient Greeks, associate use of opiates with the prolongation of life. And if you're Francis Bacon, that's of great interest to you, both of those things, the ancient Greeks and prolongation of life. But then he says the Arabians actually liked it even more. It was one of their grand medicines and the principal ingredient of their medicine. And then finally, very common trope is to associate opium use, especially with the Turks. And this is pretty much the most common claim about opium I've found from the 17th and 18th centuries, which is that the Turks use opium in a very different way to excite courage in battle. And it's actually associated with this larger fear of Turkish invasion, that supposedly Turkish physical characteristics and humoral characteristics make opium effectively turn them into berserkers. It's like this very different way of understanding the effect of the drug. So what ends up happening in these kind of texts is that as these new sort of exotic or indies drugs, such as coffee or tobacco, become conceptualized as part of the pharmaceutical corpus of early modern Europeans, they increasingly start to think of them as narcotics or explicitly as opiates. So Bacon literally says the herb, which the Turks call cafe, meaning coffee, is of the same nature with opiates. So again, when he says opiate, it's not quite the modern concept of opiate, obviously, because I'm drinking coffee right now, and I think few people who drink coffee would agree with his claim here. And then again, I see him as speaking largely about the addictive nature of tobacco here when he talks about it affecting men with a secret kind of delight and troubling the head as opiates do. So he's not quite saying tobacco is an opiate, but he's definitely using opiate as a category for understanding these other somewhat stigmatized and certainly foreign drugs. Coffee and tobacco are both quite new still in the world of Francis Bacon, and even up until the 17th century. So the fact that Europeans started to see them as opiates is quite significant. And then a final factor, the smoking of opiates, which again, I don't think it is adequately understood, but it is certainly true that water pipes are associated with Persia, Egypt, actually East Africa as well, and South Asia. And at some point in the 17th and 18th centuries, and maybe earlier in Southeast Asia, I've seen this claim that it goes back to the 16th century there's a mixing of tobacco and opium smoked through water pipes, which of course really changes the pharmacological profile of opiates when it's absorbed into the body through smoke rather than eating them. Arguably makes it much more addictive and more potent. And this again is a product of the European colonial world, because tobacco was unknown in Asia. And in fact, to a certain extent, you could argue that in many parts of the old world, smoking was unknown before it was brought by Portuguese, Spanish, and other European mariners. So I'm saying this in a very simplistic way, but this is a broad outline of what happens with the sort of orientalization of opium. It becomes associated with smoking. Smoking opium becomes associated with Asian trading regions, maritime trade ports, and opium in general gets tangled up with these fears of the Turk, fears of the Islamic world, and larger concepts around globalization and orientalization in the 18th century. Then just finally, I'll wrap up now, and this is probably something that a lot of the people watching this have much more expertise in than me, sort of more modern concept of opiates as pharmaceuticals. One thing I'll point to is there's this transitional phase in the 18th century when European medical authors start to see opiates in an explicitly more scientific way. So I'm really struck by this quote from a 1751 French medical writer who literally starts talking about Newtonian theories of light in his discussion of what opiates do to the body and mind, which I think even at the time might have caused people to roll their eyes a little bit. He's just kind of, every academic knows that sort of thing where he's throwing in a little citation of the cutting edge research to show that he's read Newton. But I do think possibly there is something to be said here, this transitional phase where the action of opiates on mind and body begins to sort of be absorbed into what we might even think of as proto-neuroscience, like early theories of nervous impulses being electrical, for instance, and new theories of mind, which are associated with the Enlightenment, are in fact influenced as well by the increasing study of opiates on a physiological level. And then meanwhile, though, there's the same period and a bit afterward, there's a continuation of that exoticization and orientalization of opium as something associated with Asia. And it gets even more kind of absurdly focused on this really kind of increasingly a racist concept of Asia as something which is filled with, what De Quincey thought of as Oriental imageries of horror, sort of a Gothic vision of Asia, association of the Indies in general with slavery, which is quite accurate because this is the height of the slave trade. And really this split that I'm talking about, I think it becomes much more permanent at the beginning of the 19th century, especially as we have the famous isolation of morphine, and increasingly as sort of alkaloid-based chemistry and pharmacy comes into its own, the ability to actually convert what had once been a sort of messy, sticky, dark colored, sort of gloopy, organic biological substance into something which is a white powder, which is odorless, made in a laboratory, sold in a pre-manufactured package, and really fully split, I think, by the end of the 19th century, into this sort of pristine pharmaceutical and this racialized and increasingly sort of illicit, natural product. Now, there are parodies of that scientific impulse of chemistry, especially directed toward Humphrey Davy and nitrous oxide and these sort of early scientific drug researchers. But certainly by the mid-19th century, we really do see this full-hearted embrace of the more modern, I would say, modern in scare quotes, but more commodified and certainly more laboratory-based way of manufacturing opiates, and especially selling them with branding, which really starts to differentiate these two strands until we end up not really having any trace of that association of opiates with the Turks or with the Indies or anything like that by the end of the 19th century. And of course, there's much more to say about the contemporary history of opiates. Again, I see the whole history as one of basically a sleight of hand. It's the same substance underneath, but it keeps getting repackaged and thought of in these very different ways. And in some cases, we actually forget that history. It's like we have a little ball under a cup. The person takes the little ball out and we think it's a new thing. It's actually this old thing that we've always had. We've always known it all along, since the Neolithic period. And yet the opium crises that I think will continue to occur, and these sort of media frenzies about opiates, I think we'll keep portraying them over and over as something new, when in fact they're something very old. So I'll end there. Maybe in Q&A we can talk a little bit about the more recent histories, because there's a lot to say about the history of opiates in the last 50 years, even the last 5 years. But if you're interested in the early modern part of the story I've told, it's in the book. And beyond that, I just want to say thank you, and you can email me with any questions, or again, to request the slides at bebreen@ucsc.edu. So I'll stop sharing now. Okay, so that's it. Yeah, I'm done. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ben, for this talk. The information that you shared and your book, Age of Intoxication, are just fascinating. And I was sort of mind blown as I listened to you and as I read the book too. So I can't wait to chat more about this. We have about 50 people in the audience. So we have quite a crowd today, which is fantastic. And I think the way that we'll do the Q&A is if you have a question that you'd like to share and you feel comfortable about dropping that into the chat box, feel free to do that. If you'd like to, otherwise, if you'd like to ask a question directly, feel free to use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and we can move to those questions too. But I'd like to start, I have kind of a burning question for you, Ben, that I'd like to start off with. So I'll get the conversation going this way. Your work is perfect for your book, your chapter on looking at the three different ways to look at opium is perfect for opening our 6-part Kreminar series, not just because it's first chronologically, right? Not just because it's set in the early modern period, but also because you excavate sort of the origins of the split between pharmaceuticals and drugs, right? So you really start to uncover in your book the ways that split started occurring in the early modern period. And you use this amazing hook in your book. It's the wall of the Pharmacy Museum in Lisbon. And I just found when I was reading that, I just kept coming back to that really evocative opening anecdote. And so my question is, first of all, could you unpack this metaphor that you use in the book for our audience here today? And also, I was just curious, how did you come to the museum? Like, how did you first notice it? Because I'm not sure that I would have been observant enough to sort of notice that division if I had just been kind of walking down the street.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually, right on my wall, I almost took it down and grabbed it, but it's a little high up. I don't want to trip, but I have a photo that I took of what Jonathan's talking about. So if anyone's been to Lisbon, you may well have gone to this place called the Miradouro do Adamastor. It's like a lookout point which looks out over the river and over the Atlantic Ocean beyond. It's a beautiful spot in Lisbon, really touristy, and it's got a little coffee shop there where I basically just used to work. Like I lived around the corner. I had a Fulbright in Portugal, so I was just like based there for about a year. And increasingly I started to observe the fact that, number one, this area is basically, I mean, I think it may have changed, but at least when I was living in Lisbon, this is 2012, it was, I think, probably the biggest drug market in the city at night on weekends. Lisbon, I think a lot of people watching this might know that Portugal decriminalized drugs. It was like a pioneering nation in that regard. I think it was one of the very first to do that. And there's been a New Yorker article and other reporting on whether it could be a model for the United States. And I have to say, living in Portugal, I was quite impressed by how it worked. You can't get arrested for drugs, for owning personal use quantities of drugs in Portugal, but you can get offered counseling by the state, by the universal healthcare in Portugal. So I really was quite into that model and that concept. And so I was really observant and watching this kind of playing out of this drug trade right before my eyes as I was writing about it. Of course, the Fulbright administrators had said, drugs are legal in Portugal, but not for Americans. So stay away from this. And so I was sort of like, watching from the outside. And so I had this sort of somewhat interesting vantage point where I was studying this stuff, but also apart from this contemporary story. And it was only later that I started to notice that the Museum of Pharmacy is literally across from the main drug selling part of this little park in Lisbon. And there's a tall iron fence dividing them. And it's like they're literally physically separated. And it just, it kind of occurred to me, this is like a perfect metaphor for the way we think about pharmaceuticals versus illegal drugs today, or just any drug really. And of course, one of the interesting things as well in Portuguese is that the word drug is a little more capacious because it can also, you can go to a drogaria to buy soap, for instance. But again, it's sort of like the word drugstore. So I just started thinking about, when did the split emerge? Obviously, it didn't happen that long ago because the word drug in many European languages still contains this more capacious understanding. And that really has been structuring the way I think about the story throughout. I'll stop there because I'm just talking about Lisbon and stuff. But I do think definitely in the history of opiates, one of the things I was trying to get at is that when we use the word opiate today, it has a connotation. For instance, a connotation that it's something you need a prescription for, perhaps, that is not really present when we go back to the 17th century. And really up until the early 19th century, there's reports of, for instance, English factory workers in Lancashire literally growing opium poppies and making their own opium. And so I think it's just like increasingly, the more I look at the story, the more I think that we have internalized these strong, categories and the strong sense of a binary that actually dissolves the farther back you go in time.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the more powerful takeaways from your book is that just how arbitrary those barriers can be, how they're constructed to separate pharmaceuticals from illicit substances. I have another question for you, and then we'll sort of get some of the audience involved. If you open, I'll preface this by saying that I'm not an early modernist. I'm a U.S. Civil War historian, right? But if you open a history textbook, you in the past would have seen the period of time that your research is set in, the early modern period. You would have seen that described as the Age of Reason, or more recently, maybe the Age of Exploration. But you call it the Age of Intoxication. That's the title of your book. But I wonder if you could sort of unpack what you mean by that. What do you mean by the Age of Intoxication, and how can we, a lot of us here are teachers, right? How can we apply that maybe in our own teaching about the history of drugs?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little, how titles are. It was not a strong claim. It was just trying to think of a title. But I do think that certainly when I teach early modern Europe, and really when I teach global history, I do think I think in this audience, this is not news to anyone. But in terms of the wider world of history, and certainly our students, it is news that what we call the Colombian Exchange, this era of sort of the globalization of plants and diseases and peoples, really was defined to a large degree by substances that are mind altering. So I once sat down with a bunch of statistics about the slave trade, the early modern slave trade in Africa, and tried to figure out from reading these very well done statistical analyses of that trade over a period of 400 years, what percentage of African slaves were purchased using a barter economy with drugs, with specifically sugar tobacco, and alcohol. And I define sugar as a drug. We can get into that, but I think in the early modern period, it is an actor category that sugar is a drug, so I'll just go with it. It was a pretty large percentage, and this is totally a rough estimate, but it was something on the order of 10 to 20%. So that's like, we're talking about millions of people at that point. So that alone is hugely important. And then we don't even get to the ecological impacts of plantation ecologies, which are being, landscapes are literally being reformatted and remade to grow drugs. And then the whole kind of cultural story, like these paintings, Sanjari paintings they're known as these paintings of monkeys and other animals that are like pretending to be humans. And they're really weirdly common in the 17th century. I think they were sort of like one of the main like novelty kitsch artworks that people would buy, as far as I can tell, because they're really everywhere. If you look up Sanjari, Public Domain Review has a great catalog of them. But one of the recurring things is that they're getting drunk. And so, or they're getting high on other things. They're smoking tobacco and so forth. And I think in large part, we can think of the 17th century as a century when people around the world are starting to respond to the fact that there are newly available psychoactive substances that their society does not have a built-in mechanism for understanding. So Peter Mancall has a book, I think, called Deadly Spirits, that's a history of alcohol in 18th century America. I may be getting the title wrong, but there's a great literature on the effect of alcoholic spirits, in particular in, there's also Jose Curto has a book called Enslaving Spirits. I might be combining the titles there, but it's about the introduction of alcoholic spirits to Angola. And what we see is like, not just in Europe, where a lot of the focus has been, for instance, on the reception of tobacco, but around the world, people are navigating this new like psychotropic terrain. They're really trying to understand how these substances not just affect their mind, but their religious belief, the landscape itself, their society. And in some ways, I think we're still living in that world. We, as global societies, we haven't quite figured out where we stand on drugs. And I think this is perfectly encapsulated by the fact that where I am standing right now in California, we've seen a huge shift in the way we define drugs. And I think the rest of the United States and many other countries will be doing that as well. I'm speaking of cannabis, but I think it's going to keep happening with psychedelics as well. So in some ways, I think this age of intoxication is kind of still happening. And I don't think, because we don't have a good, as an early modernist, I always think we don't have enough purchase in the early modern period for understanding that it started there. I think we just think of this as something that's eternal, but it's actually an historical process that's been playing out since then. And so I just wanted a little catch-all term for thinking about it in that way.
It is catchy. It's great. So we have a question here from Richard Del Rio. So I'll unmute you, Richard, so that you can ask.
And hello, congratulations on the book. I look forward to reading it. I know it's a lot of work, and I think your comment just recently really set up my question nicely, because I think this work does a nice job of capturing, I wouldn't necessarily say intrinsic, but there's kind of this porous quality to the shifts in identity, and then both in a cultural sense and just individual commodities, whether sugar is becoming a drug or whether or opium's transition to becoming a pharmaceutical, and then it just kind of expounds to what happens as institutions start shifting through these boundaries later on in history. But I think what's really fascinating about this, and my question is, what about the spiritual? I mean, during this time period that you're writing, my impression of the period, I'm a 19th century, progressive era, 20th century guy. My impression of the period is that the church is still very much involved in the production of scientific knowledge, and even the expansion of it. You have a brief period of time when the Inquisition is concerned about scientists, but then that's maybe a 20-year period, according to Ada Palmer. So what about the spiritual value of these drugs? Because I think something that's also very porous at this point in time, if you look at, for example, the psychedelic community, is that there's kind of this porous integration between, spiritual achievements or spiritual engagement and a scientific grounding for it. For example, the reason this question pops up is I thought about the relationship between opium and the experience of physical light or light in the body and electricity. So if you could maybe expound or I know it's a little bit off topic, but if you talk a little bit about the presence of the spiritual and its kind of its contribution to the movement of these things and its contribution to the history, that I would appreciate it.
No,
that's it for me.
Great question. I don't think it's off topic at all. I could have given a whole other talk exactly on that question. So I really agree with you on that, that framing. I'm going to drop in the chat the article that Luke mentioned, because it actually is sort of like the other strand of my interest in early modern drugs is more represented there. And it is explicitly about the Inquisition's response to psychedelic drugs, which I think has been slightly misunderstood. I'm not going to go over that article, but one key thing there is that the Inquisition was actually responding to the use of specifically peyote in colonial Mexico when it was mixed with alcohol and used in a widespread way by soldiers. So this is now like the kind of Isaac Campos's work on cannabis in Mexico, this association of making a drug illicit by associating it with soldiers specifically, I think is definitely happening earlier. And also peyote is getting increasingly associated with being used outside of its traditional contexts, including demographically, because the Inquisition is responding to the fact that Europeans and Africans are also using peyote in colonial Mexico. So I think that's an important distinction to make, because it's often, I think, misleadingly said that the Inquisition hated psychedelic drugs and tried to suppress them, when in fact you could actually make the argument that perhaps an Aztec elder would have also had a problem with peyote being used outside of its traditional spiritual context, right? And same with psilocybin mushrooms, actually, which are also being condemned by the Inquisition in the same manner. But I think I see that as part of a larger concern with policing the boundaries of intoxication, meaning you can certainly get intoxicated in both pre-Columbian societies and early modern Europe in a socially acceptable way. I mean, communion wine is not intoxicating, but still it's an intoxicating substance. And psilocybin mushrooms are an elite, highly prized medicine and spiritual tool in pre-Columbian societies. But when they start getting commodified and sold to people like soldiers or to merchant traveling people, sailors, that's a problem. So I think in many cases, when we look at efforts to police the use of intoxicating substances, especially in the 17th century, it's precisely because of these spiritual concerns about kind of defining a spiritual use of a drug versus its commodification. And we actually see that as well, I think, in a really famous text that many people here probably know, Counterblast to Tobacco by King James of England. He doesn't say tobacco is entirely bad for you. He says it has some medical uses. And he even kind of hints that it has a spiritual use among indigenous Americans, but his problem with it is that it's being used in the pursuit of what he calls novelty. And it's being used in taverns along with wine. And so again, I see this sort of anxieties around the blending of the spiritual and the secular when it comes to drugs. So yeah, I think it's here. Yeah, the article gets more into the psychedelic part, but another thing I just wanted to suggest is that there's interesting work to be done. I'm just going to share the Francis Bacon quote again. I've long been interested by this capaciousness of the word spirits in the 17th century. So, the use of alcoholic spirits is in play by this point to just describe like gin or something like that. But also what Bacon is getting at here when he talks about the flight of the spirits being evil. So I'm emphasizing here this little part, the flight of the spirits is evil, but the condensation of them through their flight is good. A little bit cryptic, but I see this as sort of like a pseudo-Paracelsian kind of almost alchemical, iatrochemical way of understanding the spirits as like the vital fluids or forces in the body. And I think when they talk about the flight of the spirits, we would maybe say that as something like unconsciousness, or, we would define it in terms of like the side effects of an opiate. It causes some sort of euphoric effect, and it causes you to lose your sense of your reason or something like that. But for them, it gets tangled up with explicitly spiritual ways of understanding the body as having a soul within it, right? And it's something which potentially can be corrupted by the devil. So if you think of your spirit as something which is hanging in the balance between heaven and hell throughout your life, then when you start talking about the flight of the spirits being evil, it definitely gets embedded in an explicitly Christian spiritual framework. And there's a lot more to unpack there. I have to stop there, but I actually think that if someone wants a PhD project studying like the etymology of the word spirit in different European languages from like 1600 to 1900 would be super interesting, because I think there's a ton of interesting stuff going on with that word itself.
Both in its policing, and it's also in its propagation. And I'm done.
Yeah.
So there we have a free dissertation topic for folks out there that are on the hunt. So we have a comparative question here, comparing opium with another substance, hash, from Dave Hazan. So Dave asks, I'm struck by the similarities between the hash-crazed assassin myth and the opium-crazed Turkish warrior story that you mentioned. Was there confusion around the two substances in European thought, or were the discourses around them similar?
That's another good dissertation topic. I would love to read someone who actually works with Farsi or Persian language manuscripts on this topic, because I've just informally tried to trace the assassin linkage to the word hash. It is real, like it is Hashashin, you know. So there's definitely something there, but a lot of it's much like Hulgil and Joy Plant. A lot of it is people repeating people, and it ultimately goes back to like literally Orientalist scholars from the 19th century. I'm not saying Orientalist in like a Edward Said way. I just mean British people who were like colonial administrators who like learned Farsi and Hindi and just started doing amateur scholarship on this topic. And I think it needs a lot more investigation from the perspective of early modern Persia in particular. My wife is Iranian, and she's actually from the region where the Hashashin supposedly lived. And so I didn't get a chance to actually go see the like fortress associated with them, but it was kind of like that landscape, very rocky and kind of a borderland historically. And I do think that there's something going on there, because in the early modern period, that it's a sort of like the northwestern part of present day Iran. And it's historically been contested between the Persian and Ottoman empires. So I do think there is something going on there connected to the Turkish warrior story. And I don't really know, I don't personally see the Hashashin getting mentioned that much in early modern European sources. Certainly Victorians talk about them a lot. I don't think I've ever run into mention of them in like a 17th century text though. So, oh, okay, David Guba has a chapter on that in Taming Cannabis. Great, okay, I wanna read that. But in particular, I wanna like see how it's spread east as well as west. So it would be awesome to see if like Mughal Empire writers on drugs mention it as well, and how far east it goes as well. So I'm really curious about that myself. It's a good question. I wish I knew more to answer.
And I'll just add, you know, with the Turkish opium eater trope, I guess it's such a powerful, it's such an interesting trope, and I think that has so much to do with why it remains so powerful over the 19th century. Like if you read 19th century American medical school theses, like theses that medical students would write to get their MDs, you even see med school students repeating this myth that, you know, Turkish soldiers eat opium and then they become super soldiers, right? So it's that they're just it gets back to this broader theme that you address in your book and that you've addressed in your talk about the exoticism of opium, right? So David Herzberg has a question. So David, I'll invite you to unmute yourself.
Okay, there it works. Thank you for a really terrific talk. And I also want to thank you because I assigned parts of your book for a new course this semester on drugs and global capitalism. It worked beautifully and students kept referring to it throughout this semester, which made me feel as a person who does the 20th century like I've missed the boat on certain ways of communicating things by going back to the beginning of these stories. So thank you. That's really terrific. So my question was, we see you're talking about origin stories of certain kinds of boundaries when talking about drugs at this time that I'm really persuaded by. And I was wondering about another boundary that came up when you were talking about sugar, which is how do you define which substances are intoxicating at all, and how do some of them go in and out? So the implication is that well, some of them leave like sugar because they get defined out of what the state of intoxication might mean or what official definitions are. Others, like morphine, get defined away because they become medical or therapeutic. And so in this process of refining, did you also trace a story of just like how the concept of altered consciousness itself began to have boundaries, and why some things got excluded from that, and who were the actors involved in that? What role does the developing sciences of pharmacology or neurology? I guess I'd just be curious to what you have to say about that one, which is a really deep category that we're all kind of gathered here around, this idea that we study the kind of things that cause intoxication. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, great question. And I wish I had it would be amazing to have a very short answer to that I fully agree with. I wish I did, because the way I think about it keeps changing. I mean, I initially thought the biggest problem facing any project about early modern drugs is that concept of early modern drugs, because I was really worried that it was anachronistic. And of course, anytime we apply a word that is used in contemporary context to an early modern or even 19th century use of that word, there's some slippage, right? It's never exactly the same, but that's true of everything. That's true of the word France, right? 17th century France is not the same as modern France, and no one would pretend that it is. And so it's the same with drugs. They use the word, it's used in pretty much every Romance language and many others besides. Drugs don't mean the same thing. So one of the earliest primary source documents I looked at in Portugal was, I think, from like 1512, 1514, very early, maybe 1520, but like very beginnings of Portuguese colonization in India. And it's a report, they use the word drugs, but the drugs are cinnamon, nutmeg, I think maybe sugar, musk, stuff like that. And so that was challenging, but I ended up just sort of embracing that ambiguity, because as you say, they're moving in and out all the time. And in fact, I actually think personally, sugar might get redefined as a drug soon. And again, we're already starting to see that with like, Bloomberg in New York, like I think he banned like sodas that have high fructose corn syrup or something like that. I think we're going to start seeing the return of this sort of like, drug-like approach to sugar. And one of the things that really struck me is that I brought to it all these assumptions about the subjective effects of drugs that just were proven false by how people thought about them at the time. So ambergris, which I think of as just a constituent in perfumes, like a thing that smells nice. I think in part because the Latin word that a lot of people used for drug in the 17th century was aromata, so aromatic things. And they had this theory that you're like inhaling the sort of spirituous particles of an intoxicant that enters your nose and then like changes your humoral constitution and your mind. Because it's associated on this like smell-based basis, I have sources saying that ambergris is a narcotic. Not just that it's a drug, but it's a narcotic drug, like an opiate. And I think maybe something similar is happening with other things like tobacco. So I just kind of embraced that it's a shifting category, it's a moving target, and it's still moving. It's not like we have it fixed now. As for the kind of like ways that science increasingly police that boundary, this gets back to what Jonathan was saying about the sort of persistence of this Turkish, like almost like warrior mythos of opium. There's a really kind of disturbing and weird source I found at the Wellcome Library. It's actually really interesting. It's the lecture notes of a pharmaceutical lecturer in the 18th century at the University of Montpellier in France. So it's a manuscript, and it's like his notes of how he was teaching pharmacology to 1750s medical students. And in there, he claims, I myself on the battlefield performed a battlefield autopsy on a Turkish soldier, and his blood was thicker and more viscous than French soldiers. And I attribute that to like his opium use. And it was just like this whole made up thing that is almost certain. I mean, there's no way that's true, but he was saying it in a very scientific sort of empirical sounding way. And so I think that increasingly takes on a lot of that boundary creation role as like, sort of, I want to call it like fake empiricism, and we see this all the way up to the present with the ways that if you read a scientific paper about cannabis or MDMA from the 70s, it's just like, it's almost as absurd, some of the claims being made, as like that guy, like saying that using cannabis changes your DNA or something like that, or LSD changes your DNA is one that I found. Just like, you know, there's a lot of pseudo-scientific rationales made for those roles to be defined that break down under scrutiny, but increasingly have a lot of weight because they're couched in the form of a lecture to a medical school or, you know, a journal article. So I think that's a big shift in how that role is defined.
So on the topic of moving targets, things that, you know, concepts that are really nebulous and sort of hard to pin down, what about the concept of addiction? The concept of addiction is culturally constructed, right? So you know, we know, in other words, that the idea of addiction is specific to certain times and places, right? Like our ideas today in you know, 2021, you know, America, our ideas about opioid addiction, some of them date to the mid-19th century, for example. So with this in mind, some scholars have suggested that we can't really study addiction in the past because of that cultural construction process, right? But you take a different position in your book, and I'm really interested to know if you could expound on your thoughts about this. What is your take on this issue? Can we study addiction in the past? I think I know what you're going to say, but I'd love for you to unpack that for us.
Yeah, you know, this has really been on my mind because I've actually, I don't know if people know this book by Rebecca Lemon, Addiction. I just put the link in the chat, Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England. I really highly recommend this book for anyone who wants a really good answer on that subject. I think it's like the authoritative statement about the concept of addiction, at least in early modern English. And again, this gets really blurry and difficult because arguably in each language, you're going to have to trace a different shift in the concepts of both the word for drug and the word for addiction and many others beside. So that's really hairy topic. But I do think that addiction is, I think you can make the case because it's from Latin that it's a pretty broad-based concept in early modern Europe and even medieval Europe. And as she really shows quite well, I think, in that book, it undergoes a really radical shift in especially the 16th and 17th centuries. And basically what I'm doing is just picking up from the end point of that shift that she's documenting. Certainly, as she talks about, addiction was not associated with drugs, or it's certainly not entirely associated with intoxication in the time of, let's say, Shakespeare. You could be addicted to devotion, addicted to study, addicted to any number of things. But then, and this is actually something that I've been working on as an article, partly through talking to Rebecca Lemon, because she was actually living in Santa Cruz, and I was like, we were having these interesting conversations about this. We do start to see in the 18th century a real shift. And if anyone's interested, there's even before Thomas de Quincey, who I think is one of the sort of defining iconic framers of this more recent concept of addiction, there's people like George Salmanazar, my favorite imposter in history, George Salmanazar. I'm writing an article about his addiction memoir right now, where he does say he doesn't use the word addicted to describe his drug use, but he says he basically has an addictive personality. Throughout his memoir, he says, I was addicted to novelty, again, hearkening back to King James' description of tobacco. And he says that he began using opium as part of his addiction to novelty, wanting to show himself to be different. And then he becomes a habitual user of opium. Again, he's not quite an opium addict. I would definitely not use that descriptor for someone of his generation. He was born around 1680. But I see him as the beginning of this like transitional period where we get something more like the strong association of addiction with substance use. And then also, I should mention, it's not out yet, but Carl Fisher has a book about addiction that's coming out sort of soon. Let me see here. I know he's written about it. He's actually an addiction psychiatrist who I got to know when I was on my postdoc at Columbia. And yeah, here, I'll just send a link to that too if people are interested. I think it's actually coming out fairly soon. I read it in rough draft, and I think it's really great as a kind of larger guide to the history of addiction as a concept. But yes, to answer your question, I do think we can talk about, at least in the 18th century, addiction. Before that, I actually don't. I've kind of, my thinking has started to change a little bit on this. And I think basically Rebecca Lemon is right in seeing addiction as not as a different thing if you go back before, say, 1750. And it gets reshaped, I would say, in large part, as a response to this orientalization of Indies drugs. Again, the reason I'm interested in Salmanazar is that he pretended to be from modern day Taiwan. So his decision to intentionally addict himself to opium was part of his attempt to perform an Asian identity. And that also included eating raw meat covered in spices. So he had this whole kind of made up European concept of what it was to be Asian, but that included being an opium addict. So I really see him as, well, being an opium addict by our modern terms, sorry. I see that as a really key moment, actually, before De Quincey for this kind of shift.
Yeah, that's an article I would read, hands down. So I can't wait to see the product that you produce with this. So we have a question from Kate McLean, and Kate asks sort of about the cyclical nature of addiction crises. So the question is, do you think that the recent rise in opiate use and public government response to that use is different? Or is this just another cycle that sort of fits into the longer history of opiates? So could you comment on the cyclical nature of opiate crises?
Yeah, I'm actually, I should maybe mention this. If anyone's currently working on the history of a drug called Kratom or Mitragina speciosa is the Latin name. I'm actually thinking about writing an article on that as well. And I'd love to talk because I think that we're kind of undergoing the beginning phases of another cycle of a kind of, like I was saying, a sort of bait and switch in the way we think about opiates. It's a complex topic because it has a history of use in Southeast Asia. And again, Southeast Asia really strikes me as like a center for this emergence of global discourses about opiates. But it's sort of like an opiate-like substance that is now being used in a harm reduction context by people trying to get off things like OxyContin or heroin. It's like a sort of alternative to methadone, perhaps. And I've gotten really interested in the way it's being defined, both not just in the media, but by advocates for this drug. There's a huge lobbying group forming around it that included like Nancy Pelosi's son was the director of the American Kratom Association. So I think it's a little under the radar currently, but I think it's emerging as like a new debate we're gonna have to have about whether it's legal, and if it's legal, should it be sold in convenience stores, right? Or like, well, how do we police that? And I do see a strongly cyclical nature to these sort of things, yes. And I mentioned David Courtwright, I see he's here in the audience, like his work really shows us how, 19th century stories of opiate addiction and the sort of cultural construction of the opiate addict have so much resonance with the way we're talking about the contemporary opiate crisis or opiate epidemic, however you want to term it. And I even see that again, if you go back to the 18th century, you can kind of see these like waves of attention placed on the figure of the opiate user as something which is associated with the concerns of the day, right? And those concerns change, but they definitely seem to be like a magnet for different cultural anxieties, for sure, yeah. Whether that's a question of use being cyclical, I can't answer. That's a much more difficult question, but definitely on a cultural level, I do see some kind of waves of attention toward opiates, for sure, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And after the publication, just to give one example of De Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater, there's sort of an opium, a boom in concern about opium use too. So certainly we see some like cultural cycles of attention devoted to like the fears around opiate use and abuse. So we have a question from Diana Kim. So Diana, if you'd like to unmute and ask. And Diana, by the way, I'll just add is our next upcoming speaker for the Kreminar series. So we're delighted to see you.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited, also slightly nervous. But then I still enjoyed the talk and I can't wait to read the book. I mean, there are so many light bulbs that were going off in my head listening to your speak. And one of them, which I'd love to hear you kind of dwell a bit more on, shedding light on the kind of misattribution of origins to a quote unquote Oriental context, as opposed to the kind of Western context within which you would see the initial domestication of the poppy. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about your research process and kind of uncovering that myth, given how, profoundly durable it is. And I think it's like the first thing we all encounter when we read one of these books. So love to hear a bit more about that. And then also just about how for you, understanding the very category of Oriental and the shift towards that type of discourse, what that entailed. I mean, from my perspective, it feels a lot like an empire story, like whether it's the kind of the trade and the contact with the kind of Spice Islands, the Sulu Seas, there's that type of story. I imagine there's also an empire story in terms of the nature of knowledge and the kind of orientalization of the foreigner that's going on. I wondered if those were things that would resonate, if there's an additional kind of layer going on. I'd love to hear more.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a great point and really important to think through. Especially, you know, there's a lot of slippage also in the terms that are being used by the people I'm studying, because they mostly are sort of like armchair travelers who have never been to the places they're writing about. They haven't been to Persia. They haven't been, maybe they've been to Istanbul, but that's kind of the limit of their concept of like the Indies or the East. And I think a lot of what's happening is that and this is not my idea, this is a very like well-documented, well-studied phenomenon, but the Turk, the concept of the Turk, the Ottomans, becomes like a stand-in, like a metonym for the entire world beyond Europe, not just Asia, but like really the entire world. And so like one great example is like the word turkey. You know, the animal we call turkey is native to like a region between Mexico and Texas. It has nothing to do with Turkey. It just becomes called the Turkish bird because Turkey is where that weird stuff comes from, that like foreign stuff, if you're a 16th century English person. And that's really common. And in fact, it's really, I mean, coffee itself is not necessarily from Turkey. It's called a Turkish herb because the Ottomans get associated with this sort of any trade route or culture east of Europe, right? And so there's a lot of that. I think that in some ways, when I use the term like exoticization or orientalization, I'm really kind of talking about Ottomanization or something like that in many cases. But there's definitely some exceptions. I put in the chat a little article I wrote for Public Domain Review about this really fascinating, really quite interesting primary source describing by this East India Company merchant named Thomas Bowery, who describes getting completely stoned on cannabis. Like he's super stoned. He's literally incapacitated, lying on the floor for like 12 hours by his account. And one of the people with him starts crying. Another one sticks his head into a jar for several hours. And it's just like this really weirdly vivid, like gonzo account of cannabis from the 17th century that I think deserves more attention. But one of the main things that is striking about this account for me is that he describes it as the city he's talking about in his account, the port area, is dominated by Muslim merchants. So he says not having access to alcohol, they find means to besot themselves enough with this so admirable herb, I think is what he says. He's talking about cannabis. And so he's describing this explicitly as a Muslim form of intoxication that he actually kind of likes. He calls it admirable. You know, he says, I fancied myself to be as an emperor. And he describes how actually the East India Company's, I forget what he calls them, but basically they're sort of bodyguard. I think he calls him his bodyguard, who's a native of, I think, that region of India, is the one who buys the drug for them and then explains how to use it. So there actually are like some real non-imaginary, exaggerated moments when there's an interface between Asian cultures of drug use and European ones in the 17th century. And what I actually really like about this account is it's weirdly positive. I mean, it's not entirely positive. He calls it, I think, bewitching. I think he says it has a bewitching nature, which is interesting to me. But it's pretty positive. And in fact, he obviously liked it so much that he ended up giving it, he brought it back with him. He brought cannabis back with him to England and gave some to Robert Hooke, the famous natural philosopher scientist. And then Hooke gives this whole speech to the Royal Society saying that there is no cause, I think he says there is no cause for fear, though there may be for laughter. So there's certain little moments where it's not this sort of attempt to describe a drug as in terms of its Asianness actually takes on a positive character occasionally. And I think that is something that I wish I had like sort of developed that more, but unfortunately this is sort of like a one-off in some cases. It doesn't really go anywhere, this story that I tell in that little article. And mostly it's the Turks and opium and rampaging warriors. And also one thing I haven't talked about much is sexuality, like strong associations of, you know, the tropics, or especially tropical Asia, with venery, as Europeans always call it, meaning like hypersexual desire. And that is strongly associated with drug use. So this is another trope that gets really magnified by repetition and becomes almost, I think, arguably like the dominant way of thinking about it, in addition to the one of opium causing, you know, sort of a battle lust or something like that. Sorry, that was a very fragmentary answer, but it's such a big topic that there's so much to say. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just so struck by the irony that despite all the exoticization of opium, it is, as you point out in the book and as you pointed out in the talk, a European crop, right? So I wonder if you could sort of walk us through some of the evidence. Oh, I wonder if you could, Ben, sort of walk us through some of the evidence that you found, or that has been found in the archaeological record about opiate use before the early modern period in Europe for opiate cultivation.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely not my expertise, but if you look, yeah, here's one. The opium poppy in Europe, exploring its origin and dispersal through the Neolithic. Pretty recent work is ongoing on this topic. It's something that really interested me, is that this work has actually been published since I started this project, in some cases kind of in the last few years. So I've actually thought about trying to reach out to the archaeologists doing this work. And I really think that it hasn't fully been absorbed, even among historians of drugs, but certainly in the general public. Like, no one I've spoken to thinks of opium as being native to like the Switzerland, the foothills of the Alps, which it's kind of seems to be. Now, I should say, this is still a picture that's in formation. I'm not trying to be authoritative about any precise dating to like such and such a century or even a place. It's entirely possible that it was domesticated in Cyprus, for instance, or something like that. But it's looking like Neolithic Europe is the domestication site. And I think that it's sort of incumbent on those of us who teach like both world history classes and also like big surveys about the history of drugs to make that known, because it really, for me, really radically changed how I saw this topic. It made me much more aware of the sort of constructed nature of opium as a drug associated specifically with Asia or with the tropics, and really the ways that it, as Diana mentioned, it comes out of empire. It's very much an imperial story. And that's always kind of in the background of my research. I'm reading imperial archives, I'm reading archives of literally like the Overseas Council of the Portuguese Empire, or, the Royal Society of England, which is just like totally implicated in, the Africa Company, the East India Company, et cetera. So in many ways, when we start thinking about what happens to opium in a really big picture sense, it is this de-domestication. That's a really clunky word, but it's something which is local and indigenous to Europe, and then it gets totally changed and it's forgotten effectively. But it also makes a weird kind of sense, because otherwise, why is Penelope? No, sorry, in the Odyssey, it's Agamemnon's wife, Helen. Helen is giving an opium potion to Telemachus and to Agamemnon to get over the PTSD from the Trojan War. So obviously, if you can trace this drug back to the kind of the core foundational text of, like Greek and classical culture, there's definitely like a strong evidence that that's the origin point. It's not like we have that for, as I said, as far as I can tell, there's no ancient Near Eastern sources that mention opium. It only begins with archaic Greek trade with Egypt. That seems to be the first mentions of opium I can find. And that's, again, not a story of 4000 BCE. It's more like 1000 or 800 BCE. Very different. But I'm not an expert. It would be cool to have an archaeologist here who has studied this to really talk about it more, because I think it's super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of room for kind of cross-pollination here, I think, between archaeologists and historians of drugs and pharmaceuticals. David Courtwright points out a really interesting paradox here in the chat. He points out the fact that there's a connection between something being expensive and something being exotic, right? But the irony of that is that at the same time that you see this increasing exotic, the word is hard to say, but an increasing association between opium and the exotic, you also see in Europe and also all out in the United States, the price of opium and opiate medicines plummets, right? So it's this sort of weird tension between something, opium becoming cheaper, but also opium retaining its exoticism. Could you comment on that for us? How does that jive? Does that jive?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think it's a very good point. I think this is sort of not fixed in my mind yet. I don't necessarily think this is exactly right, but again, I think this is a topic that someone needs to really research, which is the role of smoking. And I actually, I am working on an article about the African pipe in history, because Africans and also South Asians did smoke cannabis and possibly certainly other herbal substances before the tobacco pipe reached Europe via the Colombian Exchange. That's, again, documented by archaeologists. And there's also a book by Chris Duval called The African Roots of Marijuana, which is really good on this topic. He's like the expert on this. But the thing that's really striking to me, and it's kind of a mystery to me, is why is opium smoking so late to the scene? Because certainly tobacco smoking is very well documented from ancient times in the pre-Columbian Americas. Cannabis smoking, Herodotus talks about Scythians not using pipes, but throwing cannabis on a fire in an enclosed woolen tent, inhaling the fumes and howling with laughter. So Scythians were smoking cannabis. Like, that's at least by Herodotus's account, and it's actually backed up again by archaeological evidence. That seems to be true. So why is opium smoking not a thing, apparently, until maybe the 16th century? I think it has to do with the water pipe, which apparently was a fairly recent invention. Now, Chris Duval he makes the argument that the water pipe is actually an invention of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And I find that quite convincing, actually. And I won't get into there's a textual evidence chain that kind of, from travelers in Egypt, that makes me think that it probably is true, that something like a calabash or maybe a coconut was used as a water pipe in maybe the region south of the Sudan, makes its way into Egypt and then into Persia and then into India, where like people like East India Company merchants and other British imperialists assume it's always been there and it's like invented in India or Persia. But it's actually a fairly recent invention. And I think that might account for this paradox to an extent, because even though opium is getting cheaper and more widespread, opium smoking is kind of a new concept and it's very localized. I don't believe that there's widespread opium smoking in Europe, let's say in 1780 or 1800. And increasingly, when opium smoking does reach Europe or North America, it's associated with Chinese laborers, right? Or perhaps with South Asia. It's not a thing that you will find in like an ordinary medical text or in recreational use. That said, I won't get into it, but there are a few interesting little references to opium smoking, specifically in Portuguese medical texts of the 17th and 18th centuries, very rare. And the people who do reference it seem to be people who are linked in with the Africa trade and the slave trade. So I think there's something going on with water pipes from Africa, and water pipes sort of, again, like becoming associated with Persia, India, and the Ottoman Empire, and then opium smoking becomes the locus of the exotic, whereas opium use becomes super widespread and like pretty much normal, arguably normal, in the sense that you can give it to teething infants, you can buy it at stores, you can take it in place of beer after working your factory shift in the early 19th century, et cetera. Whereas I don't think opium smoking was like that. But again, I think this is something some people need to study more, because I'm basing this on very fragmentary evidence.
So I would love to, I'm just kind of thinking about the water pipe here, and I would love to be able to read some of those texts that describe the like global like spread of these pipes, and then the use of the pipe to in new ways consume opium, but that's a whole tangent. This has been a fascinating conversation. This has been a really great way to kick off the Kreminar series, and I'm really looking forward to seeing, to reading not only your article that came out today, but also your upcoming work. So at this point, I want to pivot. We have just a couple minutes left, so I'll pivot to Luke, who will sign us off. But thank you, everyone in the audience, for being here, and thank you, Ben, for such a fascinating conversation.
Thanks, all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to echo what has already been said. Thanks once more to Dr. Ben Breen for taking the time to give us this presentation. And, thanks to all of you as well for this terrific dialogue. I really appreciate some of the new knowledge that we can generate here. And just a reminder for next week that same time, same place, Dr. Diana Kim is going to share her work on the empires of vice, the rise of opium prohibition across Southeast Asia, and we're going to get a different perspective on the history of opiates and opioids. And so I very much look forward to that as well. So take care, everyone.